Chapter 16. Paul and Sophie arrived together at the office next day and immediately separated. Sophie didn't say where she was going, and Paul headed for his office, where he sat down and started to work his way through the box-art pictures, which were now severely overdue. As he ran his fingertip over the smooth surface of the photographs, he did his very best to keep his mind from wandering, but it was as hard to control as a large bouncy dog that's been kept inside for a whole rainy week. All the way home, Sophie hadn't said a word. Hers was the sort of silence that well-meaning chatter sinks into and disappears without even a ripple, so I didn't try. Paul sat next to her on the bus, staring at the back of the seat in front of him, and tried to figure out a few things, trivial as well as crucial. He didn't get very far. He couldn't concentrate. When they got home, he'd offered her a cup of coffee. She said, "All right," in a neutral sort of voice, so he'd fled into the kitchen and made the best possible cup of coffee that he could engineer, using all his skill, experience and flair. He took it through and put it on the table beside the chair she was sitting in. Sophie made no move to drink it. That was all Paul gambited out, so he sat on the sofa with his hands folded in his lap. By rights he should be shattered. Violence, precious little sleep, fear, outwitting the Queen of the Fae, near as made no odds killing her, dying, let's not forget that, and when was the last time he had anything to eat? He just felt numb, the way your mouth feels when you've had the tooth pulled but the effects of the jab haven't worn off yet. You know the pain is there, smothered under the anaesthetic, but it'll be along soon enough, and when it gets loose, it'll be no fun at all. He could sleep now, actually close his eyes and stop fighting off the pack of ravening sheep that had been poised at the foot of the wall for as long as he could remember. But he didn't feel sleepy, or anything much. "Paul," she said at last. "Hello?" Sophie wasn't looking at him. "When old Mr. Wells told me I wouldn't remember anything about the dreams, he was wrong." "Oh," Paul said. "I can remember it all," she said, "right from the start." That's... Yes, Paul, what was that? Sum up in one appropriate word everything Sophie's gone through. Alternatively, shut up. "Everything," she said. "Being her. That thing, all that time. Being someone else. Someone who wanted to kill you and everybody. All the people in the world." Just a minuscule flicker of annoyance sparked across the back of Paul's mind. "Right," it said. "I think I've got that. But what the hell am I supposed to do about it?" That must have been pretty bad," Paul mumbled. "Pretty bad," Sophie repeated. "Yeah, you could say that. The whole fucking deal was pretty bad, actually. Like feeling great chunks of me, who I am, just leaking out and not being able to do anything about it. You see, she was sort of growing inside me all the time, getting stronger. I don't know. But every time she grew, a part of me got displaced. And it's not coming back, Paul. It's gone forever. Memories, feelings, things I used to like or hate. Like when I was a kid we used to go to the seaside, and I know that one of my happiest memories was scrabbling about in rock pools for those little snail things with the shiny shells. But I can't remember that, Paul. There's just a hole, like an empty folder with nothing inside it." "I see," Paul said. "While she was still there, I didn't really notice," Sophie went on, "because all the gaps and holes were filled with her stuff, her memories and emotions, and all the things she was. Now she's gone, there's just the empty folders. I don't know, maybe I'll fill up as time goes by, but the stuff that I lost won't ever come back. It's all gone." Paul knew what she was going to say next. "Drink your coffee," he said. "It's going cold." "One of the things I lost," Sophie went on, cold and precise, as though giving evidence, "was us. I think she made a point of getting rid of it quite early on, because it was something I could hold on to, fight her with even. But she just sort of flushed it out, and I could feel it drifting away, like a dream when you wake up. I know, in an abstract sort of way, that I'd felt a certain way about you before she came. But it's just a historical fact. Like, I know who Edward III was. I can't find those feelings again. They won't be coming back." "Right," Paul said. I understand. That's it then." Sophie nodded. "Yes." "You don't think if we tried really hard?" "No." She turned her head away so that he couldn't see her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not your fault," Paul said. "I mean, you did save me," Sophie said quietly. "Sort of. You got me out of that place she took me to, and I know it was Mr. Shumway who did all the fighting and had the plan and everything, but at least you tried as best you could, so I probably owe you my life." "Don't worry about it," Paul said. "Anytime." Sophie shook her head. No, she said. It's important because you came to rescue me because you thought we were still, well, us. It'd be wrong just to say, very sorry, but it was all false pretenses. I need to make it right, or else she's won. Paul closed his eyes. But there's nothing you can do, is there? I suppose not, Sophie said. It's over. I can't pretend or anything. I'm sorry, Paul. I did love you, and I thought, maybe now she's gone, maybe I'll fall in love with you all over again, from scratch. But now I look at you and I just feel guilty. Sophie had insisted that Paul had the bed. She'd had plenty of sleep lately, she reminded him, and now she felt like staying awake for a while, which she could do perfectly well on a sofa. So he lay on top of the undisturbed sheets, his hands behind his head, staring at the lighter darkness where the white painted ceiling was, and begged sleep to come along and rescue him from the nightmare that he'd fallen into. At 7 o'clock he gave up and went into the kitchen. All the milk in the fridge had turned to runny cheese, and the one tomato that represented his entire stock of food had white hairs growing on it. She came to the kitchen an hour later and made herself a drink. This isn't usual coffee, she said. That's right, he said. Ricky Wormtoter drank all the Nescafe and got me that horrible muck instead. He said it's better for keeping you awake. Is it? Yes, Paul replied, but it tastes disgusting. Sophie nodded and tipped it down the sink. What are you going to do this morning? She said. We've got a half-day holiday, if you remember. Paul shrugged. I think I'll go in anyway, he said. I was supposed to squire a whole lot of photos for Mr. Tanner, you know, looking for minerals, and I never got round to it. Sophie nodded again. I'd better go in too, she said. I don't feel like hanging round here on my own, and there's some stuff I need to find out about before we go and see Mr. Wells. So here Paul was, at his desk, fingering two-dimensional slabs of some bit of Africa. The bauxite seemed particularly elusive today. Either that or he'd lost the knack of finding it, which would probably grieve Mr. Tanner more than himself. Maybe you couldn't find the bauxite if your heart was broken. Probably something like that. Julie came in around mid-morning. You're not supposed to be here, she said. Very true, Paul replied. I keep thinking that, but here I am. She wasn't having any of it. Mr. Wells gave you the morning off. Why aren't you at home enjoying yourself? Well, Mr. Tanner told me I had to have all these done this morning, so I thought I'd better come in and enjoy myself here. I've done this batch, but I've still got these to do. Tell him that I'm sorry, and I'll bring them up to him as soon as I've finished. Can if you like, but he's not in today. Had to go to a meeting in Bloemfontein, so he won't be back until tomorrow. So there's no rush, Julie added. You could have stayed home this morning after all. Paul's smile was like the mathematical definition of a straight line, the shortest distance in 2 dimensions between the corners of his mouth. Life's little ironies, huh? Never mind. Julie shrugged. Please yourself, she said. I only came down to tell you that it's Mr. Suslowich's birthday tomorrow, so that'll be a £5. Huh? For the cake. We always get him a cake on his birthday. A £5 each? That's a bloody big cake. He's a giant. I can come back after lunch. Paul sighed and dispersed £5. He'd been intending to buy his dinner with it, but what the hell, he wasn't hungry. Do we each get a slice of the cake? No. Fair enough. Do you want to take these pictures or not? Julie shook her head. I'll come back when you've finished. Otherwise I'll have to make 2 trips. Paul struck bauxite on the last photograph but one, ringed the spot in blue marker and looked at his watch. 1:45. That gave him 15 minutes before he was due to see Mr. Wells. Under normal circumstances, the thought of an interview with the senior partner would have puckered up his intestines like a tulip had to burst into bloom. But he wasn't bothered in the least. When you've died twice, and lost the only girl you'd ever loved twice, and done everything you could to kill the Queen of the Fae, getting frowned at by the boss slips a notch or two down your list of things to be upset about. The door opened, and Sophie came in. Paul knew it was her by the way the door started to open, which was as weird as a Frisian blender, but that's love for you. Hello, she said. Hello, he replied. Sophie sat down in what used to be her chair. We've got to go and see old Mr. Wells in 10 minutes. That's right. She picked at her fingernails with a biro cap for 15 seconds or so, and then took a small glass bottle from her jacket pocket. I've been up in her office, she said. No need to ask who she was in this context. They've locked the door, but it's one of those combination locks, and I've got her memory of what the code was. Paul frowned. What do you want to go in there for? For this. She held up the bottle. I remember she kept some for emergencies. Oh, right. What is it? Sophie was looking at him. "I've been thinking," she said. "I told you last night, everything I've ever felt for you's just gone forever, so I can't love you any more, but there's this stuff." Then Paul knew exactly what it was. "That's the love philter," he said. Sophie nodded. "It's not fair on you otherwise. I mean, it's not right that I don't love you any more, and if I drink this stuff I will. It'll be back to how it was, more or less." Paul stared at her. Inside his mind was a huge, complex tangle of thoughts and feelings, ranging from joy and relief to anger and disgust, and there was no way of knowing which part of the tangle was which. "You'd do that?" he said. She shrugged. "I don't care," she said. "It doesn't really matter what happens to me, and you'll be happy, and me too, I suppose. After all, being in love with someone who loves you back, that's the main thing, isn't it? That's what we're all supposed to want, more than anything in the world." The tangle unravelled itself in a blur, and the blur became a mental image of Melts, the fake Melts, the one who loved him with every fibre of her synthetic being, and whom he'd loved back, until he found out that she didn't really exist. What had become of her, Paul wondered, and realised he couldn't care less. "But it wouldn't be real," he said. "It'd be an illusion, like the stuff she used to do. Effective magic." "So what?" Sophie shrugged, a slight understated movement of her thin shoulders. "It's better than nothing, isn't it? And anyhow, it'd be as near real as makes no odds, because I did love you, very much. It'd be different if I couldn't stand you before, but it's just, well, like rebuilding a damaged house or something. Well, do you want me to or not? I'm not bothered one way or another." "No," Paul said. "Suit yourself, then." Sophie put the bottle down on the desk. "I offered, so don't go round looking all tragic and sad. Obviously you don't love me as much as all that." He looked at her. "I'd have thought it was obvious that I do," he said, "which is why using that stuff wouldn't be right." Sophie yawned. "Whatever," she said. "If you're going to be all picky, then forget about it." She reached out to take the bottle back, but left it where it was and folded her hands in her lap. "Which of us is going to stay in the flat? I can move back to my parents, I suppose." "Up to you," Paul replied. "I don't think I want to stay there." "Once I've gone, you mean? Couldn't bear to be alone with the memories?" "Don't say it like that." Sophie shook her head. "You should try sharing your skull with the memories I've got," she said. "I think I'd be better off going home. Being on my own wouldn't be a good thing right now." Paul looked at the wall. "If you're sure," he said. "It'd be better," she replied. "I'll get my stuff at the weekend, if you want. I'll pay my half of the rent till you can find someone to share with." He grinned bleakly. "I'm not the sharing kind," he said. "I'll look for somewhere smaller. Anything larger than a shoebox gives me agoraphobia in any case." "That's not true." "No, it isn't. Does it matter?" "No." Sophie was still looking at him. "Paul," she said, "what happened to her?" Not a question he wanted to answer. "How do you mean?" "I remember her leaving me, but that's all. Is she—" Paul shrugged. "I don't know, is the honest answer. Mr. Wells did something to her, sent her through the portable door, said something about the Isle of Avalon, if that's any help." Sophie frowned. "That's in Somerset, isn't it? Where they have the big rock festival." "Is it? I don't think that's what he could have had in mind. I thought Avalon was where King Arthur went, and probably Elvis and Princess Di and JFK and Shergar and all that crowd." He thought about that for a moment. "She'll fit in well there," he said. "Her kind of people." "I suppose." Her brow furrowed. "What I mean is, she can't come back, can she? I couldn't stand it if I thought she could come back." Good question, Paul thought, and he remembered what Mr. Wells had said about Countess Judy continuing to do consultancy work. Saving the human race was one thing, but J.W.W. was in business to make money, and that apparently had been something Countess Judy had been very good at. Absolutely no chance of that," he said. "But what about the stupid door thing, if that's how she got there?" "Yes," Paul said, "but I've got that, and nobody's going to get their hands on it except me. Promise. Unless you want it. You can have it if you like." Sophie looked at him, and he didn't know how to begin to interpret her expression. "No thanks," she said. "You keep it. It'll be safe with you. After all, you're a hero, aren't you?" Paul actually managed to laugh. "You're right," he said. "With me it's about as safe as the stock market. But I think I know somewhere where it will be safe, if I can face going there again. Come on," he added. "We'd better go and see Wells." "Essentially," Mr. Wells said, steepling his fingers on his desktop, "everything you've been told is true. You both of you bought from your respective families by this firm, which is why we can force you to continue working for us against your will.
Furthermore, Mr. Carpenter, you were indeed bred, if you'll pardon the expression, with the sole purpose of concluding Ernest Carpenter's work against the Fae and their proposed invasion of our side of the line. Ernest Carpenter was for many years a partner in this firm.
What happened? Paul asked. Did he retire or something? Mr. Wells' face betrayed a tiny trace of embarrassment.
He was made to leave, he replied. The partnership felt that his ongoing enmity towards the Countess de Castel Bianco was having an adverse effect on the firm's business. Accordingly, he was paid the value of his share, and he left. He then proceeded to devote the rest of his life and his entire financial resources to carrying on his fight against the Fae. When his money was all spent and his credibility in the trade was damaged beyond recovery, he took his own life, intending, as we know, to return once he had completed the job. It's a tragedy that his obsession should have cut short quite a brilliant career.
Just a moment, Paul said. He saved the human race, didn't he? Mr. Wells nodded slightly to concede the point.
Arguably, he said, as though Paul had won a trivial point on a technicality. To return to the matter in hand, he went on, I've discussed the matter with my partners, and we've decided that since neither of you were what one might call free agents as regards to your part in recent events, it would be inappropriate to take disciplinary action against either of you. We feel, although your actions were directly responsible for the loss to the firm of a partner and a very considerable proportion of the firm's income, you are in effect acting under duress and therefore can't be blamed for what happened. In consequence, as far as the partnership is concerned, the matter is closed.
Before Paul could say anything, Sophie was on her feet.
This is a test, right?
She said. Mr. Wells looked at her.
I beg your pardon?
A test, she said, to see if I'm really me or something, because it can't be for real. You can't be saying you just went through the most incredibly horrible experience ever and saved the human race, but it's okay, we aren't going to fire you. Even you.
Miss Pettingale, Mr. Wells seemed offended. I fail to see what could possibly prompt such an outburst. Your actions have indeed damaged the firm and cost us a great deal of money. However, we accept that neither of you are to blame.
Sophie called Mr. Wells part of the male anatomy. This didn't seem to help, but at least it shut him up for a moment.
I can't believe it, even coming from one of you lot. My life's been totally ruined. Paul nearly died.
Actually, I did die, Paul said mildly, twice.
And you seem to think I actually want this lousy job. Well, all I can say is you must be even more of a stupid fat jerk than you look, which I wouldn't have thought was possible, but apparently you managed it. You got that? I quit. I'm leaving. Goodbye.
Sophie swirled around and marched to the door, which wasn't there anymore.
Miss Pettingale, Mr. Wells said slowly, with the air of someone wrestling back his temper with both hands on a kettle prod. When I mentioned the possibility of disciplinary action, it wasn't dismissal that I had in mind. The firm has lost quite enough money recently without forfeiting the substantial capital investment represented by our purchase of you. What I had in mind was rather more along these lines.
Whereupon Sophie burst into flames. How long Paul sat in his chair and stared at her he could never quite figure out. It seemed like a very long time indeed, but he also knew that he was on his feet and lunging at her before she started to scream, which was almost immediately. Mr. Wells tried to stop him. He had remarkable reflexes for a man his age and size, but Paul slipped past him and grabbed at Sophie with both hands, trying to beat out the fire. He was vaguely aware of the pain and of Mr. Wells shouting, and then Paul's eyes went dark, and all he could think about was the unbearable heat, which he couldn't get away from, whatever he did. He could feel his skin shrinking and melting, and then nothing mattered apart from how much it hurt. He lost his balance and hit the ground, and he wondered what Mr. Dowell would say to him this time. Someone was saying, and he had a hazy recollection of having known someone with that name a long time ago in a very bad place. He wondered why he was lying on his back with his eyes shut. He opened them.
"Paul," said Benny Shumway's voice, which was odd since Paul was looking at a car.
His car. His maroon Volkswagen Polo with a chip in the windscreen where the gravel had hit it, that time when he went to Gloucestershire. "He's awake," said the car, and Paul remembered that her name was Monica, and that she was Ricky Wormtorter's sister. That reminded him. "Sophie!" he yelled, and tried to get up, whereupon a large hand pressed down on his chest, squeezing all the air out of his lungs. This was presumably for his own good.
"She's fine."
Now Paul could see Benny's face looming over him like a bearded rain cloud, and in the background the plain whitewashed walls of the cashier's office. He wondered for a moment what a car was doing in the smallest office in the building, and then he thought, magic. What the hell?
"So are you. It's all right. You're safe."
But either he could share this bloke Paul's memories, or... But she was on fire, that bastard Wells...
"Relax," Benny growled. "It was only trick fire. J.W.Wells patent non-oxidizing flames. It burns, but it doesn't consume. God not included. Bush sold separately. Amaze your friends and hurt your enemies a lot."
"Quiet," the car said. "Paul, the fire only felt like it was burning you. It doesn't actually do any damage. The same with Sophie. She's all right." "Oh," Paul said. Oh, all right, but why did he do that? I know she lost her rag a bit, but..." Benny laughed.
"Sounds to me like you're under the impression that Jack Wells is a nice man. You know, a bit pompous and gruff, but all right, really. And always on hand at the end to rescue everybody and make it all right. I have to tell you that's not really how it is."
Paul sat up, and this time Benny let him. "I'd sort of gathered that," he said. "Did you really do that to Sophie just to punish her for being rude?" Benny shrugged.
"He's old-fashioned," he said. "Doesn't hold with attitude and bad language, or with anything that doesn't make money for the firm. Losing money is pretty much guaranteed to piss him off on the quantum level."
Paul shook his head, as if he could get rid of the weirdness just by shrugging it away. "But Sophie was right," he said. "We rescued the whole bloody world."
"Which is fine," Benny said, "provided you do it on your own time, and it doesn't screw up the balance sheet. But don't expect any thanks, least of all from Jack Wells. He's not evil, like in Dark Lords and stuff, but he probably only saved the human race if he was sure of getting a valuable prize once he'd collected the whole set. The point is..."
Benny hesitated and then made a what-the-hell gesture with his hands.
"Let's face it," he said. "You're a hero, capital H and everything. True, you don't look it, but so what? Kaz Suslovich doesn't look like a giant, but you should watch him eat sometime. Or not," he added with a slight shudder. "Fact is, you were a hero before you were even fucking born. Your Uncle Ernie saw to that. Every gene in your body practically hand-picked. You've got hero instincts, including a heavily edited version of the self-preservation thing. And sad to say, but it's perfectly obvious, you've got hero brains. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all heroes are as thick as school custard, but in certain respects they're not smart. Couldn't be, or they couldn't do the job. Paul, my friend, you are all hero, and you've just got to face up to it and come to terms. And part of being one is, you can't see mankind in the crosswires or a damsel in distress without getting this overwhelming urge to leap in and help, even when it's the dumb thing to do, even when it's not wanted." He sighed. "But most people aren't like that, and particularly people in our line of work. Think about it, will you? Guys who can do magic. Think of all the good they could do, the differences they could make. Just cast a spell, wave a wand, and you've got an end to hunger and injustice. You've got world peace. You've got a sea full of whales, and everybody learning to get along with each other. And God only knows what. Or so you'd think, you being a hero and all. But we, people in the trade, our minds don't work like that. We think, how do I use this special gift I've been given to make an obscene amount of money without getting noticed and locked up in a government research lab or a funny farm? And you know what? It's good that we think that way, because nothing in history ever did more harm to the innocent and defenceless people of the world than well-intentioned people with power trying to make things better. That's why they threw Uncle Ernie out of the firm. Paul, he tried to breed a monster, magical powers and a hero mentality. That is you."
"Oh," Paul said. "Right, well, thanks for telling me."
"No charge. But now you can see why Jack Wells and the rest of them forked out a small fortune for you. And they got a bargain at that, because you're the only specimen in captivity. Add to that the special bonus features, like the fact that you're part Goblin, which means that you can find mineral resources just by looking at aerial photographs. You're a walking goldmine. No pun intended. Getting the two of you together..."
"Benny," snapped the car, "that's enough." "What do you mean the two of us?" Paul said urgently, but Benny just shook his head.
"Not for me to say," he said, "but here's a clue. If you can figure out why Judy was so dead set on getting your Sophie for her replacement source, you'll be in the right area. And that's your lot on that topic. I've said too much already. Probably still a bit dizzy in the head after Ricky bashed me and locked me in the strong room while you two were dealing with Judy. He sighed, which was the right thing to do, I guess, because I would have tried to stop you. Oh, I'm over her now, he added quickly as the car revved ominously. Because she's gone after all, and so her power's gone too. I'm out from under her spell, thanks to you. Both of you.
That's better, the car said, a trifle grumpily. She was a very bad person, and you should be ashamed. Benny grinned.
I am, he said. Trust me.
Paul thought it'd be a good idea to change the subject. So, he said awkwardly, you two are, well, you know.
Benny nodded. Talking of which, he added, it is my sad duty to break it to you that you haven't got a company car anymore. Dennis Tanner handed me the keys this morning.
Monica's engine purred involuntarily.
Ricky was pretty uptight about the whole thing. Told me that if he ever catches me giving my car a good polish and wax, he'll rip my lungs out with a garden fork. But he'll come round, he added cheerfully. They always do. I mean, when you consider he was so desperate to get her off his hands that he was prepared to try and fix her up with you.
Anything that Paul might have said was drowned out in the blare of Monica's horn, which carried on until Benny apologised and promised to be good in future.
It's true, though, he added. Obviously he thinks well of you, birds of a feather, I guess, because Ricky's all hero, from his toothpaste smile to his carbon fibre reinforced socks. I had assumed you'd figured that out for yourself, actually. I mean, why else would a junior nobody like you get assigned a company car?
Don't go there, Paul told himself. It's never worth it. Well, he said, I suppose I'd better be getting along. Thanks, I guess.
But Benny shook his head. Small job I'd like you to help with, he said. Just the usual trip to the bank, paying in and drawing tomorrow's cheques. Only I thought you might want to come along.
What, me go back in there? Paul shuddered, and doing so felt the edge of the cardboard tube that held the door rub against his ribs. Actually, he said, yes, why not? I'd like a quick word with Mr. Dow if there's time.
Good lad, Benny nodded approvingly. Right, we'd better go. He smiled rather nauseatingly at the car, which indicated back. See you later, honeypot, he said. Thought we'd have a quiet evening in, just you, me, a gallon of transmission oil and a Haynes manual.
If Monica had made a noise like that while he'd been driving her, Paul would have taken her straight to the garage. Now at least he knew what it signified, which was something. The disturbing thing was, his dad had a Rover 2000 that made exactly the same noise when going up hills.
You again,
said Mr. Dow, but Paul knew him well enough by now to interpret the tiny discrepancy between the levels of the sides of his mouth as a smile. Paul grinned weakly. Me again, he said, but this time Mr. Dow raised his hand.
Quite so. And Mr. Shumway, what a pleasure it is to see you again.
Benny grunted something that Paul didn't catch.
Business as usual from now on, he said. You heard about the doings topside, I take it?
Indeed, Mr. Dow said.
I would imagine it is all for the best. The Fae have never been regular clients of the bank for obvious reasons. Naturally, when an unfortunate situation arises, we tend to look kindly on those who favour us with their custom. Beyond that, he added, we find it hard to motivate ourselves to take more than a passing interest. We are peaceful people down here, Mr. Shumway. We prefer it that way. Excitement disturbs our tranquillity of mind, reminding us of what we once were and can no longer be.
Benny shrugged.
It's a point of view, he said. Anyhow, we're pretty much back to normal on our side of the line, so with any luck we won't be doing anything to upset you for a while.
There was a slight but deep sadness in Mr. Dow's smile.
Nothing upsets us, Mr. Shumway. We are incapable of feelings so intense. Now then, he continued briskly, here are tomorrow's wire transfers and statements for the deferred deposit accounts. I regret to have to tell you that a cheque drawn on the Commercial Bank of Isfahan was only partially burnt by the gentleman who's been looking after your duties during your absence.
Dennis Tanner, Benny interrupted, scowling with exasperation.
He never got the knack of holding the very edge of the corner, so of course he burns his fingers and lets go. Still, he's management, so what can you do?
Mr. Dow nodded sympathetically.
If you could see to it, I should be very greatly obliged. I have in fact processed the cheque so as not to cause embarrassment.
Thanks, Benny said. Oh, and the kid's got something he wants you to keep safe for him. Very safe, he added, as in you know where. Paul didn't know where, but he wasn't entirely sure he liked being called the kid. But he decided not to take the point. Just this, he said, taking the cardboard tube out of his pocket. If it's all right, I'd like it so that nobody but me can get near it. Nobody, he repeated, reproaching himself as he did so for unnecessary melodrama. Of course, Mr. Dow said, and in the circumstances, I think the bank will be prepared to waive storage fees given the nature of the item. A rather frosty look passed across his face. We're very proud of the fact that over the last 2,000 years, nobody has even tried to rob the bank, knowing that it would, of course, be impossible. However, actually, Jack, that's not quite true, Benny put in. There was that Brooklyn gang about 40 years back. Mr. Dow nodded. Technically, I suppose. But since they could find no way of getting in here other than suicide, and had omitted to make arrangements for their passage back, I tend not to count that as an attempt, but more as a fitting punishment for stupidity. That incident aside, then, there hasn't been any trouble of that sort in our long and distinguished history. However, once I became aware of the existence of that, he went on, glancing down with distaste at the cardboard tube in his hand, I must confess to certain misgivings. Whether it would be capable of breaching the bank's security, I have no way of knowing, since the experiment has never been tried. I would prefer to keep it that way, and accordingly I shall rest in peace more easily, knowing that the only instrument in this world that might be able to break into our vault is safely inside it. I should warn you, however, that you will be able to retrieve it one time only. Since it has been withdrawn from our keeping, the bank's standard terms and conditions clearly state that you should wish to return it to store. A standard administration fee will be payable. Oh, Paul said, thinking. Aggravating, but that's banks for you. How much?
A life, Mr. Dow replied calmly. Either your own or that of someone prepared to die willingly in your place. A similar fee will be incurred, he added with the merest shadow of a grin, on each subsequent removal. We are, after all, a business, not a charitable institution. He held out his hand. Goodbye, Mr. Carpenter, he said. It's been disturbing knowing you.
Benny didn't seem his usual chatty self on the way back to the office, which gave Paul a chance to agonise over whether he'd done the right thing in effectively getting rid of the portable door. Probably just as well, he decided. Recent events had shown that the wretched thing wasn't safe to leave lying about, and hiding it or never letting it out of his sight was simply inviting abduction, torture, murder, and other similar inconveniences. Being able to nip out to Copacabana for a lunchtime drink wasn't really worth it, all things considered. And besides, he had nobody to go with any more, so it really didn't make any odds. When Paul returned to his office, he found Sophie sitting in her old chair. Hello, he said. She looked past him.
Please don't, she said. Just pretend I'm not here or something. I'm only here because I haven't got anywhere else to sit, and that bastard Tanner's sent me down the whole stack of these bloody things to do.
Paul hadn't noticed the heap of Mortensen printouts on the desk in front of her. How are you feeling? He asked.
Oh, fine, Sophie said. After you did your stupid heroics thing, Wells put us both out. I was okay straight away, but you'd lost consciousness. Then Mr. Shumway turned up and took you away, and Wells said I'd better get back to work. So I came here and found this lot waiting for me with a note.
Paul nodded. I don't think they're very nice people in this office, he said.
I think you're right. Shame we're stuck here for the rest of our lives, really.
He sat down. He could only see the top of Sophie's head because of the pile of printouts. Here, he said. I'll help you with them. Don't refuse, he snapped quickly. Just don't. All right.
Please yourself, she said. If it makes you feel better, you carry on. Only I thought you had bauxite to scan for.
I'll work late, Paul replied. The goblins won't bother me getting out, and I've got nothing in particular to go home for.
Don't start.
I'm not starting. It's true. Now, you take the top half and I'll do the rest. It seemed like old times, sifting meaningless paperwork together in sullen, embarrassed silence. Paul couldn't help remembering also the last time he'd had this job to do, when Countess Judy had used it as a trick to make him fall asleep and dream her invasion force over the line. As far as he knew, they were still out there, albeit cut off from their chain of command and lines of supply. Hundreds or maybe thousands of the fair, masquerading as malignant children somewhere in the greater London area. Cheerful thought, but not something he was allowed to worry about on the firm's time, apparently. All right, he told himself, I won't worry about it then. Screw it. Somebody else's problem. He thrust the matter out of his mind, turned the full force of his attention on the printouts, and soon drifted into sleep. Hello, said the monsters. Wait a minute, Paul objected. I'm through with all this stuff now, aren't I? Countess Judy's gone. Why can't I have my proper dreams back? The monsters giggled.
We're the good face, silly, said the younger specimen. Remember us? We dropped by to warn you that night when she had the bomb planted in your metal thing for keeping old letters in. We just wanted to say thanks, that's all.
Yes, I remember you now, Paul said, oddly touched in spite of everything. Well, it's nice to have somebody appreciate me, even if... He hesitated. Even if it's only hideous monsters, wouldn't be very gracious. Even if this crowd here don't seem to think much of it, he said clumsily.
Oh, we're very grateful, said the elder monster, mostly on account of I'm queen now. Well, acting queen, because she's still queen theoretically. Did I mention she's my big sister? You'd never think it to look at me.
Oh, I don't know, Paul replied. Same eyes.
That seemed to please the monster no end. That's very sweet of you to say so, though you're just being nice. Anyhow, all we wanted to say was you won't be seeing us again, any of us. From now on, your dreams are off limits to all the Fae, us and them. Which means, said the younger monster, I won't be able to come and visit you anymore, but that's probably just as well, for your sake.
Sorry, Paul said. Do I know you?
Silly, the monster said, as her face and shape dissolved and reformed. Now do you recognise me? The girl of his dream said, smiling nicely. It was fun, but it's time for you to move on, isn't it? You won't be needing me anymore.
Oh, won't I? But...
She giggled. Don't worry about it, she said. Can't say any more. Not with the skinny girl there. After having her camping out in her head all that time, I wouldn't be surprised if she can hear us. But it'll be all right eventually, one way or another. You'll see.
Before Paul could say anything, they'd gone, and he sat up with a start. What? He said.
You were asleep, Sophie said. You were muttering. I hate it when you do that. It's spooky.
It was... Sorry, Paul said. It shouldn't happen again, anyway.
Good. Look, why don't you get on with your bauxite stuff and leave this to me? After all, I don't care how long it takes me. If I get it all done, they'll just find me something else to do.
Paul sighed. Fair enough, he replied. Look, I know we can't be... I understand what you told me, and if that's how it's got to be, that's that, I suppose. But we've still got to work together and be in this rotten little room all the time, so can't we at least be friends? Otherwise it's really going to get to me, and I've got enough to put up with as it is.
Sophie looked at him for a moment and then nodded. Well, not enemies anyway, she said. How about allies? Us against them.
All right, Paul said. 2 heads are better than one and all that sort of thing. We stand a better chance of getting out of here in one piece if we team up, and then... He looked away. And then we can go our separate ways and not bother each other anymore. How's that? As he said it, he thought of Mr. Dow. It's been disturbing knowing you. And then he thought, if I still had the door, couldn't I just step back through in time before Judy started squatting in Sophie's head, and maybe we could figure out a way? He frowned. If ideas like that were anything to go by, putting the door where he couldn't get it might well prove to be the best thing he'd ever done. Sophie left at chucking out time. Paul stayed behind to finish the last 100 or so pictures. Either there wasn't any bauxite in wherever the hell this was, or he'd lost the knack of finding it, temporarily or forever. Like he cared. Dutifully and methodically he traced each photograph with his fingertip, then added it to the done pile. When the last one went face down, he stood up and reached for his coat. "Waste of time," said a voice behind him. "I could have told our Dennis that, but he wouldn't listen to me." "Crying out loud," Paul said, once he started breathing again. "You nearly scared me to death." "Sorry," Mr. Tanner's mum lied. "Only you were so deep in it all you couldn't hear me come in. You look so sweet, prodding photos like our Dennis when he was learning to read." Paul realised that she hadn't bothered to transfigure herself into a beautiful girl this time. She was all red eyes and claws and teeth. For some reason he felt vaguely proud that he hadn't noticed it straight away. "Yes, well," he said, "I've just been forgiven for saving the world and then set on fire. I could do without a bollocking from your son into the bargain." "He's not that bad, really," said Mr. Tanner's mum. "Well, no, I'll tell a lie. He gets that from me, probably, because his dad's a real sweetie. But I ain't come here to talk about our Dennis." "Good," Paul said. "And I hate to say anything to upset you." "You couldn't, trust me. Now, what I wanted to ask is, I went to see the doc earlier today, and he reckons the baby's due the middle of next week." It took Paul a moment to remember that she was pregnant.
Hard to tell with goblins. Anyhow, Pip and I are having real trouble settling on a name. He wants to call him Christopher Vincent Horatio after his dad, and I'd sort of set my heart on Azar Grishnak Rupert after my favourite uncle. And we talked about it, and we were sort of thinking, since Pip and I would never have got together again but for you, if it'd be okay if we called him Paul.
Paul?
She nodded. Paul Azar Christopher. It mean a lot to both of us.
Paul blushed. He said. Yes, right, by all means. I'm honoured, he added, and to his surprise he was telling the truth. Thanks, he said. Thanks a lot.
Mr. Tanner's mum smiled. When she wasn't being beautiful, she had a nice smile, though you had to look quite hard to see it behind the tusks. Also, she went on, it's this sort of big tradition with us goblins. It's very important who you ask to be the kid's godfather. Like we had Theo Van Spee for our Dennis, and Carly Grandma was my godmother, and my dad had the Dark Lord himself, rest his soul. We take it seriously, you see. It's got to be somebody you respect and admire who's still alive, not under sentence of death by exoration and unmarried. So we thought he'd ask you. Paul didn't know what to say.
Seriously?
Yes, seriously, you clown. You don't have to do much. You got to strangle a manticore with your bare hands at the ceremony, but Ricky reckons he knows where he can get this really old sick one with no teeth. And you're expected to buy Paul Hazel Christopher his first scimitar, but our snot-nose knows a bloke who can get you one at trade. And anyway, that wouldn't be for a couple of years. Please say you will, she added. It'd mean a lot to both of us.
All right, Paul said. I mean, yes, I'd be delighted. It's really nice of you to ask, actually.
She spoiled it a bit by slapping him on the back, jarring half the bones in his body, but he forgave her.
Cheers, she said. I'll tell Pip, me chat and nuts.
Will he? Great, Paul said. And really, it's the least I can do. I mean, you've helped me a lot, rescuing me from High Wycombe and everything.
Yeah, but I had an ulterior motive, Mr. Tanner's mum said, with a rather unnerving chuckle. And just because I'm asking you this doesn't mean I don't still fancy you. It's all right, she added quickly. I promise I'll behave at the service. You don't have to worry about that.
I'm sure you will, Paul replied feebly. Let me know as soon as you set the date, all right?
Course, right, she went on. It's time you weren't here. Young lad your age, you should be out enjoying yourself, not stuck in a mouldy office all night.
Yeah, right, Paul mumbled, and he headed for the door. Then something occurred to him, and he paused. Is it true, he said, that we're related, that, well, I'm part goblin? Her eyes opened a little, and then she nodded.
Who told you that? She said.
I sort of worked it out for myself, Paul replied sheepishly. And then Mr.
Call him Dennis, she interrupted. After all, you're cousins.
He confirmed it, Paul said. Cousins? What sort of cousins?
She shrugged. Dunno, lots of times removed. Distant enough, if you see what I mean. Paul looked away till she'd stopped leering. But yes, your family all right. One of us.
One of us. Amazingly, that sounded rather good. Goblins, for crying out loud. But yes, he liked the sound of it. Well, he said, you can't be any worse than my human relatives, that's for sure.
She sniggered. So I gather, she said. I mean, we can get a bit boisterous sometimes and maybe break stuff, and sometimes when a party gets out of hand or whatever, we've been known to eat people, just occasionally, but we don't go selling our kids, no matter what.
Paul nodded. I'm surprised you're prepared to acknowledge me, he said. Black sheep of the family and all.
Not a bit of it, she replied cheerfully. Take people as you find them, that's our way, or just occasionally with salt and vinegar. And anyhow, it's us that should be proud. I mean, it's the first time we've ever had a genuine hero in the family.
A what?
Hero. You.
Mr. Tanner's mum shook her head.
Honestly, you get this simple look on your face, and it's a wonder nobody's oiled you out and used you as a canoe. Actually, she said, one of these days when you're not busy, you ought to come down and meet the gang.
Paul looked at her. I'd like that, he said. And if he didn't mean it, maybe it was mostly because he was shy anyway. But not for dinner, he added quickly. I mean, I'd hate you to go to any trouble. When she'd said good night, he was just fast enough to get out of the way of a cousinly kiss, and he'd heard the front door lock turn behind him. He walked down the road as far as the bus stop. It was coming on to rain, and part mage, part goblin or not, there was bugger all he could do about it except get wet. He'd been standing there for maybe 3 minutes, just long enough for all his clothes to get saturated, when a low, sleek red sports car drew up beside him and the passenger door opened. "Hop in," said Ricky Wormtaut her. "I'll give you a lift home." "No, thanks, really," Paul heard himself mumble. "Why, it's pissing it down. It must be miles out of your way."
What way? Ricky said. Don't worry about it. Jump in before you drown standing up. All right, Paul thought, might as well. He didn't like getting wet, though whether he could get any wetter was a moot point, even if he jumped in the sea. He opened the door, moved an axe and a medium-sized can of Slaymore off the seat, and climbed in. Ricky drove the way he'd have expected, so Paul spent most of the journey with his eyes shut and his fingernails dug into the web of the seatbelt. It's all right, he heard Ricky say eventually. We're here. You can come out now. Paul replied. I mean, are we? Good. Thanks for the lift. Ricky grinned. It wasn't that bad, was it? No, it was fine, Paul muttered. Any faster and we'd arrived before we left, but you sound like my mother. What's the time? The clock in this thing doesn't work. Not surprised, Paul thought. If you didn't know why, ask Einstein. 7:05, he said. Fine, come and have a drink. I know this nice little pub just around the corner. Paul hesitated for a moment. He wasn't really in the mood for any of Ricky's dragon hunting stories, but he could use a drink that he didn't have to pay for. All right, he said. It's not 3 Tiles, is it? Because they have live jazz on Tuesdays and... Not just 3 Tiles, Ricky confirmed. Follow me. Ricky's idea of a nice little pub turned out to be a hidden door in the side of a disused warehouse where you had to knock 3 times and ask for chalky, whereupon bolts grunched and hinges creaked, and a tiny little man in a leather jacket with spiked studs on the cuffs let them through. It was at this point that Paul realised that he didn't know all that much about Mr. Wormtorder, and maybe he'd been better off going home and having a nice cup of tea. But he followed Ricky down a long corridor and through another small door, and found himself in, for want of a better description... Here we are, Ricky said. What'll you have? A mead hall, complete with high rafters, long tables and benches, rush-strewn floor, a long fireplace running the length of the room, and smoke you could carve. Not many in tonight, Ricky commented, and that was probably just as well, since everyone in the place was shaggy-bearded, mail-clad, and armed to the teeth, and as soon as Paul walked into the light, they all turned and stared at him. Ricky was networking like a radio station, and most of the people he nodded to nodded back, though some of them muttered and turned their backs. They sat down at the end of a bench, and a large red-headed woman slopped down a huge jug and 2 horns in front of them.
What is this place?
Paul whispered. Valhalla, Ricky replied.
Oh,
Paul said. Sort of a theme pub, you mean? No, Ricky said. Drink up. The regulars tend to get a bit tense if they see someone not drinking. The whatever it was in the jug tasted rank, but slightly less alcoholic than ginger beer shandy.
I thought you had to be dead or something,
Paul said. That's right, Ricky replied, wiping his mouth ostentatiously on his sleeve. At least you have got to have died in battle, which of course you have. I can put you up for membership if you like. Thanks, Paul said, with all the sincerity of a cabinet minister. So, you must have... Ricky nodded. Technically, anyway, he said, breaking into underworld to steal the 3-headed hound of hell counts as dying. Though they did have to refer it to the membership committee. I think it's nice to have somewhere you can get away from the usual crowd. Paul drank some more of the whatever it was. The taste sort of grew on you, like verdigris on copper. Actually, Ricky went on, I wanted to have a chat with you about a couple of things. Mostly, I guess, to say thanks. You were a great help. The business with Judy and so on. That's all right, Paul mumbled, somewhat flustered. I'm just glad someone thinks I did the right thing. Ricky frowned. You haven't exactly made yourself popular at the office, I grant you, he said. I can see that it must be a bit confusing for you since you're still pretty new to the business. I'm getting the idea, Paul replied, gradually. Benny Shumway explained a bit about it earlier today. Just takes some getting used to, really. You could say that, said Ricky, grinning. I've been in the trade, well, a good many years now anyway, and I still don't know the rules. You just have to do the best you can and try and see it from their point of view wherever possible. Take Judy, for instance. Very good example, in fact. On the one hand, she's a total menace. On the other hand, she makes an obscene amount of money for the firm. Obviously, when it comes to the crunch, you have to take a view. From my standpoint, it's fairly clear-cut. If she has her way and the Fae wipe out this human race and take its place, in the long run, it's going to have serious repercussions on my corner of the market. Humans need heroes. The Fae don't. They don't use money, hence no banks, no large accumulations of wealth. Therefore no dragons, and dragons make up a good 40% of my workload. Sure, by reproofing and maximizing returns, I could make up maybe half of the shortfall in other areas, such as vampires and the evil overlord sector, but it still means a shortfall, and if I don't meet my target come the year-end partners meeting, I'm going to have some explaining to do. So basically, one of us had to go, her or me. It's a pity, he added wistfully. She had a stunning client portfolio in entertainment and politics, and we're bound to lose a fair slice of that, regardless of who we get to replace her. Still, it's a hard old world, and you can't make omelettes without killing the goose that laid the golden eggs, as we say in the trade. Just a moment, Paul wanted to say. All that stuff, fighting the fear, losing Sophie, dying, and it was all just office politics. He wanted to say it rather a lot, but he knew instinctively that Ricky wouldn't understand what he was making such a fuss about. Oh well, he said, and refilled his horn from the jug, which was still full to overflowing. Time to change the subject before he said something he shouldn't. Ricky might have turned out to be no better than the rest of them, but an indebted bastard is rather more useful than a resentful one, and offending his only ally on the letterhead probably wasn't a good idea. A funny thing happened earlier, he said. Mr. Tyler's mum asked me to be her baby's godfather. Is that right? Ricky turned and looked at him. Congratulations, that's quite an honour. It's well worth keeping in with that crowd, especially in our line of work. Really? Oh, yes. Ricky nodded gravely. Not much in the way of dragons, of course, but they do get a lot of pest trouble. Cave trolls, gnomes, goblins, and so forth. Nice little filler jobs you can do when things are quiet, and from time to time they have wars, border disputes, and so forth. A good goblin war can mean serious billable hours, especially if the other side's got in outside help too. Of course, Dennis has got the goblin sector pretty well in his pocket, being family and all, but it never hurts to have contacts of your own. I see, Paul sighed. A couple of tables down, two very large men had started bashing each other with axes. Their armours seemed to be standing up to the blows, and they were laughing. Probably the local equivalent of a friendly game of darts. It's good about Benny Shumway and... He stopped abruptly, unable to remember whether Ricky, the real Ricky, not Judy in disguise, knew about that yet. Fortunately, Ricky smiled. Yes, I think so, he said. They'll be good for each other, I think, and if he can find some way of turning her back, that'll be a nice bonus. Though at times I get the impression she's happier as she is. She was a very difficult teenager. Being a cow's been mostly a positive experience for her, I think. Right, Paul said vaguely, and stood up. Well, thanks for the drink. I think I'll go home now. Ricky nodded. I might stay on for a bit, he said. Never hurts to be seen, you know. Oh, before you go, I've got some things for you. Paul hesitated and sat down again. Really? He said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Here. Ricky delved into his inside pocket and took out what appeared to be a small silver paper knife. He tapped it 3 times against the edge of the table, and it grew into a full-size sword, complete with scabbard. If you're going to stay in the pest control sector, you will need one of these, he said, and to be honest, I never did get on with it, so you might as well have it. Paul said. He took it reluctantly, as though it was liable to bite. Thanks. Her name is Skofnung, Ricky went on. Used to belong to King Hrolf Kraki. Go on, take a closer look. Rather nice pattern, I think. Well, you have to be polite, so Paul gripped the scabbard with his left hand and pulled the blade out an inch or so. To his surprise, it wasn't bright and shiny. The edges were dark brown, with intricate patterns of silver specks and whorls, and in the middle was a sort of sea blue. Damascus steel, Ricky explained, or at least Paul guessed it was meant as an explanation. You'll never find two the same, which makes it easier, of course. All right, Paul thought, I'll ask. Makes what easier? Ricky narrowed his eyes. Finding her, of course, he said then. I forgot, you obviously don't know. It's a living sword, right? Is it? Somehow Paul got the impression that the sword hadn't liked him saying that. I mean, right, yes, obviously. Ricky laughed. A living sword, he said, is special because it has a life of its own, which is good because it knows what it's doing when it's in use, so you don't have to. But it does mean you have to find its other half before it's much good for anything. And, he added, grimacing slightly, I have to admit I never did find her, and without the other half, of course, it's pretty much useless. Paul managed not to sigh, though he really didn't feel in the mood for any more of this sort of thing. Other half, he said. That's right. A living sword has a human counterpart, and once you find... Oh, excuse me.
Ricky said suddenly, and Paul noticed that a huge, ferocious-looking warrior type was standing by the door and waving. But look, I need to see about something. Look, you hang on to the swords for now, and I'll explain another time. See you at the office tomorrow, he added, and hurried across the room, leaving Paul sitting bemusedly with a large sword and table in front of him. Hesitantly, he picked it up, and it was painfully heavy, and he couldn't imagine being able to do anything useful with it, except maybe weigh it down an extremely large pile of paper. He considered just leaving it there, but Ricky might notice and be offended, and then he remembered. He picked it up and nudged the side of the table with it 3 times. At once it shrank. It was like holding a live fish, until it was paper-knife-sized again. Paul looked at it. Oh, well, he said to himself, more junk, screwdrivers and scalp badges and bits of coloured glass, and now this. I'll have to get myself a garden shed to keep it all in. Still, it was a thought that counted, presumably. He managed to find his way out of Valhalla without getting stabbed, walked slowly home, and let himself into the flat. It was dark and very quiet, and empty. When he switched on the light, he saw empty spaces where things had been. Sophie must have been there, picked up her stuff and gone. She'd hardly taken anything, but the gaps left seemed huge, unchartable, like the Atlantic before Columbus. Well, Paul thought, here I am. He found an old shoebox to keep the magic bits and pieces in, sellotaped the lid shut, and stuck it on top of the wardrobe, where he wouldn't have to look at it. Then he brushed his teeth, hung up his suit, got into his pyjamas, and went to bed.